It's the end of the trading week, which means, of course, it's time for our weekly wrap-up. And looking to the biggest market movers this week, I'm joined by Kieran Williams, market reporter with Live Squawk. Welcome back to Dukascopy, Kieran. So firstly, US NFP results just out, standing at 295,000, higher than estimated, and a rise from last month's figure of 257,000. What's your initial reaction to this result?
Obviously, it's a very good figure. I think the key thing here, though, is not so much to look at the actual job gains. I mean, we've been above 200,000 for the past 6 months or so, which is an almost unprecedented run of good figures. The key is to look more where the slack in the labour market is. I think that's what the Fed's going to be looking at, and ultimately, that's what people care about, this non-farm payrolls number, so they can try and predict the future path of rates. So the U6 measure, which is the measure of underemployment, which is obviously very closely correlated to the amount of slack in labour markets, that did fall slightly, but it's still at 11%, which is still quite an elevated rate. So obviously the Fed aren't going to take too much solace from that. The other thing to look at is the participation rate, which actually fell back to a 36-year low of 62.8% this month, which is obviously not good, because that means that that's artificially distorting these unemployment figures. Obviously the headline unemployment rate fell to 5.5%, but as I said before, that's artificially distorting these, because so people that have given up looking for a job, effectively, if they've become too disillusioned with the labour market, or if they, feel that they aren't going to find a job and therefore just don't bother looking, they don't actually count in this figure. So that 62.8% is actually quite a worrying figure, I think, for the US economy. And the other figure to look at is wage growth. Obviously, wage growth was slightly below what we expected this month. I mean, compared to last month, we did see 20 states, they rose their minimum wage, which was one of the reasons that we had such a bumper figure last month. And I think the other thing to look at is obviously the impact that lower oil is having on the labour market. We saw in the Challenger job cuts figure, I think it was Wednesday, that those are up 21% on an annual basis. Over a third of those are coming from the energy sector. A lot of these companies in the US especially are suffering from this lower oil price because their break-even rates are around $60 to $70 a barrel. Obviously, at the moment, we're hovering around the sort of 50, 55 level, depending on what day it is. And that's really not going to be good for them in the future, because it can only mean more layoffs coming up. So I think that, in general, whilst it is a very strong figure, you have to look at the longer-term trend overall and how these measures of economic slack are actually picking up, or, as the case would appear, to be dropping slightly in terms of the participation rate.
The Indian Central Bank unexpectedly cut key lending rates on Wednesday, just days after a new budget was unveiled. Governor of the Reserve Bank of India said in a statement that with inflation under control, the bank felt it had room to act in support of the economy. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. Obviously, this cut came just after the budget, so with the budget out of the way, the road is clear for a series of rate cuts, which is what seems to be expected. A lot of analyst comments that I'm reading, they expect that at least one more cut is in the bag this year. Potentially, they expect a 0.5% cut, which would obviously imply 2 cuts of 25 basis points each. So, as mentioned, this comes after the budget, which was disappointing, really. So this decision, it also shows that the central bank and the government are working together well. Obviously, Modi and the central bank governor have not always been on the same page, but this time they do appear to be. So we also saw indications of further cuts in their bi-monthly report from the RBI. So they did mention they're keen to monitor CPI. Obviously, that CPI, this is the first time that India have actually implemented, in recent times anyway, a formal inflation target. So they want to see inflation around about 4%. They said plus or minus 2%. So it's obviously quite a broad range, broader than what we have in the West usually. But I do think that they'll be able to do that. And I think that inflation as well, the sort of relatively benign inflation environment, is going to do quite well for them. So I think that it's a good thing, really, that India have cut, and I think that it's going to prompt quite a lot of economic optimism. One worry is the sort of divergence of emerging market central banks. So Brazil, we saw the other week, they hiked their rates. Obviously, with India dropping their rates, that's going to cause some potentially volatile flows, and it's also going to mean, the term currency wars is bandied about a lot, but I do think that with that sort of divergence, it's going to become ever more evident, and I think that India especially will potentially struggle with their currency.
The ECB press conference was yesterday. Mario Draghi announced that the QE program would start on Monday, while the ECB raises its growth forecasts for the Eurozone. So what did you make of the announcements? Anything in particular you were focused on?
I think beside from the obvious, obviously, the ECB, they applied a sort of soft floor to their purchases, so they would only buy bonds up to that negative deposit rate minus 0.2%, which rules out Schatz, obviously. What was interesting, we did see an immediate reaction in Schatz on the back of that. which is interesting. I think that the 2-year yield climbed to above that level. Longer yields also fell. There is a risk that the current long yield levels illustrate too high hopes that as soon as ECB starts buying, yields will see another abrupt fall. And if that doesn't happen, we could see about a profit taking and a bit of a jump in yields, which could affect the dynamic of the curve. I think the other interesting aspect to look at here is the updated forecast, as you mentioned. So the inflation forecast for 2017 are only 1.8%. So you've got to consider that Draghi, when detailing the program, he did say that this program would continue until they hit the 2% inflation target. It had originally been touted to finish in September 2016. But if these inflation forecasts are to be believed, then there's still going to be some way to go for the ECB, even in 2017. And I think the other thing to consider, as one of my colleagues pointed out earlier, is that the ECB are notoriously optimistic in their forecasts, as most central banks are, really. But that means that if they expect to hit 1.8 and their potential will be even lower than that, we could see another year, maybe on the outside, even 18 months of purchase, or if that didn't transpire, we could see some different action from the ECB. The unemployment rate is also, their forecast is also quite interesting to look at. So they forecast a 2017 unemployment rate of 9.9%, which is eye-wateringly high compared to the UK and the US, which are both looking, even at the moment, around 5 to 5.5% levels of unemployment. So whilst the weaker oil and also weaker euro, obviously you've seen the euro fall this week below 110, lowest in 11 years. There's been a lot of coverage about that. Even though that could help inflation, and obviously that will make the Eurozone more competitive and help employment, obviously the ECB, as mentioned, notoriously optimistic forecast, they still don't see that having enough of an effect to drop unemployment lower and inflation higher. So I think that's going to be really something to look at.
Thanks, Kieran. As always, great speaking with you. That's all for this week's wrap-up. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to click back on Monday. For now, though, have a good weekend.